I think we were always a little bit wary of the deck landings because it obviously was never built as a carrier aircraft. The undercarriage was fragile, to say the least, for thumping down on the deck. And the other problem we were anticipating was the lack of visibility.
My very first landing, I had an accident.
We lost more aircraft crashing on takeoff and landing than we ever did actually in aerial combat.
Now in the Navy, we got some Hurricanes too. It had a much better view out of the cockpit than the Spitfire.
I don't think there were any vices on the Hurricane for for landings or takeoffs.
The Seafire was fundamentally a Spitfire. It had come into life in the RAF as a pure fighter to destroy enemy aircraft, both fighter types and bomber types. Therefore, quite restricted in operational capability. Its endurance in the air was rather short. It had no other weapons other than 8 machine guns in the first samples. And it was very much an airfield interceptor fighter. This wasn't good enough for naval operations where you needed more fuel, because sometimes the carrier would be going in the wrong direction when you returned and you couldn't get on board for a while. You needed extra endurance. You needed extra strength because your landings tended to be harder than on an airfield. Also, the weapon side of it needed to be expanded. So before very long, we were away from the Mark I Seafire onto the Mark II, which had, instead of 8 machine guns, 2 cannons and 4 machine guns. We had stronger undercarriage. We had a slightly raised cockpit, giving you a better view, and the strange arrestor gear in the Furious was smartly removed and replaced by a more normal one. Ultimately then, the Spitfire was turning into a reliable naval fighter. And the other attribute, which was added very shortly afterwards, was the ability to carry a 500-pound bomb on a rack underneath between the undercarriage legs. This became a primary weapon later on when the resistance from the enemy in the air was much reduced, and the army was becoming much more vulnerable to dive bombers.
In 1938, it was fairly obvious that war was coming, and as a young man of 18, I was going to get involved. So I thought I'd rather fly than be called up into the army. So I thought I'd either go into the RAF, but as it happened at that time, both my sisters had boyfriends in the Fleet Air Arm, Short Service Commissioned Fleet Air Arm. I thought, well, let's go Navy, so I decided to go in the Fleet Air Arm. For the first 6 weeks, it was purely naval training, no flying, whatever. And we went in as sailors, or we were naval airmen second class, wearing the sailor rig, bell-bottom trousers and all that. And we went to barracks down at Gosport. And I think that was about 6 weeks before we actually started any flying at all. I went to Luton to do my initial training, which was run by RAF, a flying school run by RAF. I think I was average. I think some pilots managed to go off in about 8 hours, I think, and they allowed you up to 12, I think, before they dipped you. I think I took 10. So that was the elementary training. We then went on to intermediate training. We went to Netherhaven, where we went on to battles of all things, a fairly large jump. But eventually managed to pass out of there, where one gets one's wings, and then to fighter school at Yeovilton. The instructors selected whether you were going to be a fighter pilot or a torpedo bomber pilot. In those days, either went to the Swordfish or Formers, is really the main aircraft at the time. I did my first deck landings in it, and it's a very easy aeroplane to fly and ideal for deck landings, which is one of the big advantages of it.
I left school in the summer of 1939 and discussed things with my father, who was then in the Royal Air Force, and got to the point where it seemed to me that it would be a good idea, as soon as I was of the permitted age, which was 17 3/4, would you believe, I would join the Royal Air Force on a short service commission. My father didn't say anything, but the next day he said, I wouldn't join the Air Force if I were you, because at the moment they're having a terrible trouble in training command, and they literally are losing about 20 to 30 student pilots killed every month. And to me it seems a shambles. When I was old enough, which was about September 1939, I applied to join the Fleet Air Arm, and I was accepted and actually put on my uniform in March 40. And we were sent to the Royal Naval College at Greenwich to travel daily down to the air station at Gravesend to do our basic flying training on the de Havilland Tiger Moth. The instructors were all civilians at that time, but almost exclusively ex-RAF. He was a very keen aerobatic pilot, my instructor. I started to feel airsick. I suppose I'd done about 15 or 20 hours flying with him by then. He took me on one side when we got down, and he said, do you realize that if you're airsick and the chief instructor finds out, we'll be out, we'll be thrown out immediately? And I said no. And he said, but I think that your flying ability is above average, and I think that would be an awful pity. So don't you, under any circumstances, tell anybody about this, but we're going to do a completely different flying training program for you to cure you of your air sickness, but at the same time to train you to fly the aeroplane properly. I came out perfectly satisfactorily at the end when the chief flying instructor gave me my final test. We did a little flying towards the end of the advanced course on an aircraft which was just becoming obsolete in Bomber Command in the RAF, which was the Fairey Battle, and that gave us a good feel of a much bigger aeroplane with a beautiful Rolls-Royce engine and a much higher speed. So that did give us just a little idea about what the operational flying would be like.
From Yeovilton, I joined a squadron up in Scotland flying martlets. We eventually operated on the Illustrious on the way round to Madagascar. I was seconded onto an escort carrier and finished up in America. Eventually posted as senior pilot to the Martlet Squadron. Came back into this country and we converted then from Martlets onto Spitfires, and that was my first association with Spitfires. The first impression was real delight. You know, it was the aircraft that everybody wanted to fly, so one had that feeling of being sort of honoured and proud to fly Spitfires, really. And the thrill of taking that off, compared with the any other aircraft I'd ever flown. Even with the Hurricane, the sheer delight of the speed, maneuverability of the Spitfire. It was just a great feeling, lovely aeroplane.
We were given a railway ticket, told to catch the train to the south of France. When we got there, we found there were some skewers and lots of gladiators on which we would do some takeoffs and landings from the small carrier HMS Eagle. One of our pilots, who was ill at the time, failed to take off properly and crashed into the sea, but he was uninjured. The aircraft was lost, of course. Otherwise, we all passed the course and were put back on the train to the UK. Suddenly, when I heard that we were going to have a naval version of the Spitfire, I went and borrowed a Spitfire, an RAF squadron, and had a go in that. So that was my very first experience, before the Navy actually had any. I must say it was a dramatic experience in many ways, because in the first instance you were really tucked into the cockpit, strapped in as part of the aircraft, with not a great deal of space to move. Secondly, the view forward was not very good until you had got into the air at a fairly high speed, and then the nose of the aircraft dropped and the view was vastly improved. Also, you sat in a position which was about almost the center, a little bit further aft perhaps, the center of the wing on each side of you. So you couldn't see much downwards. And this was a very important point from the point of view of air fighting, of course. You've got to see the enemy all the time if you possibly can. However, the attributes of the Spitfire certainly obliterated the problems. The wonderful power of the Merlin engine in that small, comparatively light fighter was tremendous. And the speed, as you saw it on the speedometer when you were flying level, was remarkable. Sitting there in the aircraft, you were part of it. And the maneuverability was such that your control of it was much better than in any other aircraft. The controls were light and positive, and basically it was a joy to fly because of this and the power in the engine. And then, joy of joy, after about another 4 months later, I was told that I was going to go to the first Naval Spitfire squadron. The Naval Spitfire was called the Seafire. Now, just in passing, I must say here, I can never understand why it was called the Seafire. Other types of aircraft were called by their proper names, like the Sea Hurricane, Sea Hornet, etc. But they invented this new name for the Sea Spitfire, called it the Seafire. I thought was a great pity, because it detracted from recognition of what the aeroplane was. People said, "What's a Seafire?" all the time. I'd heard somewhere in my life the word Seafire used in a different context. I looked up Seafire in this dictionary, and believe it or not, the definition of a Seafire was a nauseating purple-coloured sea fog, much feared by sailors, and luckily very rare. I tried to make out why they call it a Seafire, but I never did, never have. I was appointed then to the first Seafire squadron, and very luckily, because I was quite experienced by then, I was the second in command of 807 Squadron. We worked up down at the Naval Air Station at Yeovilton. When we had done sufficient flying practice, practiced deck landings and so forth, we were appointed to the old aircraft carrier HMS Furious. The Furious was a strange ship in many ways. The flight deck, when you flew across it, had a dip in the middle, fore and aft dip, so that the stern was higher than the center, and then the bow section, where the catapult was also higher than the center. And this made taking off somewhat weird that you sort of went down in a trough halfway up the deck before you actually got to the point of leaving the deck.
The main difference from the Market to the Spitfire was in fact the size of the cockpit. Nearly all the American aircraft, like I flew Corsairs and Hellcats as well later on, had much bigger cockpits than the Hurricane and the Spitfire. There wasn't a lot of difference between the Hurricane and the Spitfire cockpit, but the Spitfire cockpit was fairly, not exactly cramped, but you really did feel part of the aircraft instead of sort of moving around inside it. You were part of it.
After a period of working up ashore, of course it came time for 807 Squadron to embark in the Furious. Landing aboard was tricky. The landing signal officers became very important indeed, and one relied on them enormously. In fact, my very first landing, I had an accident because, firstly, the landing signals officer had never actually controlled a Seafire before to land on the deck. As I touched down, I was a little bit left wing low, and then I landed on the left wheel. The Spitfire series of aircraft, of course, had very small landing wheels, and as I touched down, my port landing wheel, instead of going over the wire, went underneath it. Though I caught one wire with the arrestor hook, I was also arrested by the port wheel, which tipped the aircraft on its nose. It was a tragedy. The other pilots all managed to get on board okay, and we then went ashore to do more training, and we got a better understanding of it, and after that we had less and less difficulty with landing aboard. Even quite inexperienced pilots later on were able to land satisfactorily on the very small assault carriers, which were converted merchant ships.
I think we were always a little bit wary of the deck landings because it obviously was never built as a carrier aircraft. The undercarriage was fragile, to say the least, for thumping down on the deck. And the other problem we were anticipating was the lack of visibility, because to get the speed down to deck land, you had to get the nose well up, and you could see absolutely damn all straight ahead of you. So that's what we were a bit wary of. But we did a lot of dummy deck landings on the aerodrome to try and get used to how we were going to handle it. And pilots had different versions of how they were going to handle it. Some stuck their head out of the side, and eventually, if one got more experience on the Seafire, one could manage to side slip it in and kick it out straight at the last minute. And that was the method I used eventually most of the time.
During my time in the Naval Air Development Unit, which became the Service Trials Unit later on, as I'd mentioned, we flew most of the naval aircraft at the time, and fortunately we were provided with some Sea Hurricanes. In actual fact, I think the ones we had were ex-RAF Hurricanes that had been fitted with an arrestor hook and nothing much else. But this was a very, very interesting aeroplane because, in fact, when you look at history, the Hawker Hurricane had done a bigger job in the Battle of Britain than the Spitfire. So it was a very, very important aircraft in the RAF at that time, and much beloved by all the pilots. But of course it was quite an obsolete type of aircraft, having a fabric-covered airframe and so forth, and not much in the cockpit of way of modern facilities. But it was a very good aircraft to fly, very reliable and very tough. Very strong aeroplane. If you did a heavy landing, it didn't mind, and so forth.
From the training type aircraft, of course, first time you go into a Hurricane, you immediately feel the extra power of a military operational type aircraft. Far more power than the old Battle had, for instance. And it was a nice aeroplane to aerobat. Very, very easy for aerobatics. Generally a very steady aeroplane to fly. I enjoyed it, but I didn't fly it a lot, but it was an enjoyable time. Landing a Hurricane, there again, the visibility was better than in the Spitfire. The nose wasn't quite so long, so once you got the nose up you could see more for the landing than you could see in the Spitfire. I don't think there were any vices on the Hurricane for landings or takeoffs. It didn't swing badly. The undercarriage was fairly wide, so it was fairly steady on the ground.
Now in the Navy, we got some Hurricanes too, as an interim aircraft before the Seafire was fully developed. Now, I only flew one incidentally a couple of times, but we did have operational squadrons. Not for a very long period, I think 2 years, that's all.
Since our last Malta convoy story, other cameramen have returned, bringing with them more pictures of the colossal sea and air fight, which went on without pause for 3 days. One newsreel man was aboard the ill-fated carrier Eagle for part of the voyage. It was from the Eagle and other ships like her that Fleet Air Arm pilots took off to break up the waves of enemy aircraft flung against the freighters on their way to succor gallant Malta.
It was, as the RAF, any RAF officer will tell you who flew them, a wonderful aircraft. It had a much better view out of the cockpit than the Spitfire. It was more rugged. I mean, if you did a heavy landing in a Hurricane, it was not likely to be damaged, whereas the Spitfire was fairly delicate in some respects. The squadrons who flew it on board the carrier found it a very easy aircraft to deck land with its very wide undercarriage. It was very stable on the deck. It had a much better view of the cockpit for deck landing. It was so much easier to see your way into the carrier's deck. It was an aircraft which you could summarize as being not as operational as the Spitfire, stroke Seafire, but a safer, more reliable aircraft in many ways. Stronger, safer and more reliable. I did quite a few hours on the Hurricane, but never flew it operationally. It was an airplane I really enjoyed.
As early as 1939, it was thought that adapted Hurricanes, or Hurricats, could be rocket launched along a rail from merchant ships to protect them from enemy aircraft. The ships were known as catapult aircraft merchantmen, or CAM ships. Few operations could have been more hazardous, because after combat, the pilot either had to bail out or ditch his aircraft into the sea and hope to be picked up.
Out of all the aircraft, I think the Hurricane was the most popular to fly, mainly because of its reputation, I think. And there again, you felt far more compact in it than one did in the Martlet. And it was a very stable, very steady aircraft to fly. As I say, I don't think it had any landing vices as such.
First operational flying of the Seafire in the Navy was from HMS Furious, and the first sorties were carried out in the Mediterranean against the Vichy French in North Africa. In the Seafire Squadron, we were required to encourage the French WWII fighters to get into the air in the hope that we would be superior and leave airspace available for our very slow biplane bombers, the Albacores, to go and bomb the French airfields and gun positions. So our very first sortie was what was then, those days, called a fighter sweep.
Do you hear that? Duty flight deck crew, range operational.
In a vain attempt to fool the Vichy French, the British Fleet Air Arm painted its aircraft in pseudo-American markings. These included Fulmars, Albacores, Martlets and the Seafire. Much of the painting was done in situ on the aircraft carriers.
It was on the heroic, the epic scale that the United Nations conceived and carried out the descent on North Africa. 350 men of war, most of them from the Royal Navy, escorted an armada of 500 transports. The heaviest available air protection went with the convoy. The aircraft bore American markings, but they were flown by Fleet Air Arm pilots. Sea power, making fullest use of the air arm, was demonstrated as seldom before. Never have so many men at one time been carried so far in military history. U-boats were not the only menace. Reconnaissance planes, which might have called up bombers, were discouraged. Fighter planes of the air umbrella were continually returning to refuel. This one doesn't quite make his landing, and he's off to try again. Air photographs of the landing areas were distributed to Fleet Air Arm pilots as the convoy neared the Atlantic coast of Africa. Such objectives as coast batteries were clearly marked.
We suddenly found ourselves being attacked by WWII. They were inexperienced pilots by and large. I managed to shoot one down. We lost one other Seafire, which was shot down by anti-aircraft fire. But I think overall we did an immense amount of damage to them on the ground there. As I left the operational area with no ammunition left, I was attacked quite far away from the base by a WWII, which managed to get a burst in very, very well aimed. One of his cannon shells hitting my aircraft just behind the seat and exploding in the fuselage. When I got back to the ship, I couldn't lower the flaps because they were damaged. I couldn't talk on the radio because it didn't work, and unbeknown to me, luckily, the damaged control wires to the rudder and elevator were just, but only just working. I did an emergency landing aboard. After that, I really couldn't believe that the state of the aircraft was in. I was very, very lucky to escape.
Well, to deck land an aircraft, one had to get the speed down as low as possible. And to get the speed down as low as possible, one had to have the nose fairly high, and you went in on throttle at stalling speed, basically, or just a fraction above stalling speed. And then when you were near enough to the deck, you immediately cut your throttle, dropped immediately. So you had to be fairly close to the deck for the aircraft to drop without damaging it. So if you were that fraction too high, and the batsman couldn't always get it exactly right, then it did go down a fairly heavy landing, and that could either burst tires or actually have a collapsed undercut. And then the collapse, of course, it had a propeller bent as well, and even the engine probably mucked up the whole lot. So there was quite a number of those, mainly through, not badly judged, but the deck wasn't at the right place at the right time, because the deck was always moving anyway. So they were pure accidents.
Unserviceable aircraft are a liability, particularly in a carrier. If there's a shortage of planes and carriers have to go back for replacements, they become vulnerable to attack from the air, and they can't do their main job of providing air cover either for the fleet or landings. The maintenance and repair men are the men behind the pilots, and the pilots depend on them to keep the planes serviceable. Fleet Air Arm maintenance is one of the most important jobs in the whole of the service. It's the maintenance men who, by their efforts and knowledge, keep the aircraft airworthy. Keep them flying is their aim.
Basic training, once we came off of square bashing and discipline systems, was with the RAF, and they took us through everything. starting from the basic engineering principles of nuts, bolts and that sort of thing, onto the gypsy moths and things like that, and then the Domini engines on the Rapide, and then up to the bigger engines, the 9-cylinder Pegasus. And so they trained us right the way through until we passed your exams and you were fluent in what you had to do. I mean, basically we're taught the rudiments of all aero engine work from the RAF. I first met the Merlin when I was on course at Ennisford. Then when I came out at the end of 45, the first time I met the Merlin, it was on the, as I say, on the early Seafires. The Merlin was a good engine to work on. It's much everything was in front of you. Once you took the gear off, you could see everything and work on everything, and then it could be taken off and replaced. One of the first big mods that came out was the anti-G devices, where when the engine Merlins that used to roll over, they used to cut themselves out and then come back to the fuel. And then Rolls-Royce brought out this ball device that had to be fitted in the line, so that when it reverted over one way, it blocked itself off and the fuel came on another line. So it was like a two-way floating ball. So as it went, inverted itself, it closed that entrance, the fuel, into the carburettor, and then when it came back to normal, the fuel ran back the other way. So it had a constant supply of fuel, whereas previously, when they were going over on their back, they cut themselves out and then came on again. So they eradicated that. I thought that was a brilliant, so simple, but such a brilliant idea.
Every one of us who was going into operational flying trained on a catapult and then instructed what was going to happen. How to, for example, hold your left arm rigid with your fist behind the throttle so that when the catapult fired, the throttle couldn't flick backwards and shut the engine off. You made all the right signals, holding your fist behind the throttle, gripping the control column tightly with your elbow in your tummy so that your arm couldn't come back. Then you opened the throttle full and the signal was given and there was an almighty bang and you went unconscious. Completely blacked out for a fraction of a second. And the next thing, you found yourself flying off the end of the catapult. You then had to quickly wake up and take control and fly the aircraft away, because it was probably only just a few knots above the stall at that point.
As time moved on, the catapult became more refined, which meant that launching points on the Seafires could be removed, which in turn saved considerable weight.
I think I was one of the first Seafires to be catapulted off a fleet carrier for the Illustrious. And I think the excitement overcame me a bit, and I landed with my hook up that crashed into the barrier. But I got away with that because in those days they blamed the deck landing officer for if the undercarriage wasn't down or the hook wasn't down, he got blamed and not the pilot, which was a bit unfair, really.
They took off the enormous exhaust manifolds. We had 3 each side on the Merlin engine and in the Seafires and early Spitfires. And that, for deck landing point of view, was difficult because there they were when you were landing in a curve on the flight deck. These huge exhausts were right in your line of sight, making it difficult to see. Those were taken off and exchanged for small stub exhausts instead that improved the view a lot.
During my instruction period at Yeovilton, they asked me to do some certain experiments with rocket-assisted takeoffs. And I think this was in the very, very early stages of that. And they put carriages on the wing near the fuselage, put 2 rockets on each side, so you had 4 rockets in all. What they wanted to know was that if 2 rockets went off on one side and the 2 on the other side failed, what would happen to the aeroplane? So I did these experiments with various alternatives, 1 rocket on one side, 2 on the other, etc., and then 2 on one and none on the other. And if one knew it was coming, it was controllable. But my personal view was, and I put in a recommendation, that on a carrier with inexperienced pilots, if, say for instance, the 2 port rockets worked and the 2 starboard rockets failed, the chances are the Seafire would go into the island. By taking off in the Seafire, at the best of times, was a fairly exhilarating, really surge of power. But with those rockets, you know, you thought you were going to hit the sky. It's thrilling, but there again, you knew what was going to happen, roughly you knew what was going to happen. And it was almost like being catapulted off.
Among the many jobs tackled by the Fleet Air Arm is that of convoying. This particular aircraft carrier is engaged in shepherding a convoy along the vital Anglo-American lifeline across the Atlantic. Seafire aircraft were soon at work spotting U-boat packs or raiding enemy aircraft. These dramatic pictures show something of the action which followed. One of several Nazi raiders destroyed in this action. To the pilots of the Fleet Air Arm, ticklish takeoffs and landings are just part of the job. Nevertheless, every time a plane comes in, it must be a pretty tense moment for everyone concerned. The Royal Navy has taken wings, but its great traditions are unchanged.
I had an engine failure at about 30,000 feet over Taunton once in this country. Managed to get it back to Yeovilton with a dead engine. That's when I found out that you could glide approximately a mile for every 1,000 foot of height in Spitfire or Seafire.
All the Fleet Arm courses have been doing their initial flying training in England, either Elmdon or Zealand. But we were the first course that was sent to Canada to do our initial training. And we were also the first course to be given the Cornell aircraft to train on, which was a plus because it was a monoplane as opposed to the old Tiger Moth, which most of them did their initial training on. Having finished the preliminary course, we then went to Kingston, Ontario to go to the advanced training on harbours, and then down to RNS Airfield, Yeovilton, Somerset, where we did our training on Seafires. We were there for 2 months doing our final training before we went to HMS Ravager on the Clyde, which was a converted American banana boat, to do our 8 deck landings before we could finally pass out as a Fleet Air Arm pilot. And I remember taking off the very first time from Ravager. Instructions like climb to 1,000 feet, circle, come round, look at the ship, and I looked down and I said, where is this ship? Eventually I saw it, it's the size of a postage stamp. I thought, my God, have I got to land on that thing? So of course we did the usual approach, and of course the Seafire was never designed for deck landings. The thing was that it had a very, very long nose, and when I had to land on at stalling speed, therefore you couldn't make a stern approach as all the modern aircraft do. You had to do a split-arse turn just before you land on the deck, watching the batsman all the time, and then cut the engine on his instruction and hope that you catch a wire. 8 deck landings were completed, and back to Greenwich Naval College for a 2-week what they call the knife, fork and spoon course on how to be an officer, and then posted to a squadron which was formed up at Lyon Solent, HMS Eagle, and joined 887 Seafire Squadron, which was the Seafire F, which was the high-level version of the Seafire. The 894 Squadron, which was the other squadron on the Indefatigable, which I subsequently joined. That was a low-level engined Seafire, which was due solely for attack purposes and low-level flying.
But from Yeovilton I was posted as the CO of Seafire Squadron, 894 Squadron. We did a lot of working up, eventually finished up on an escort carrier. We definitely had larger squadrons than the RAF ever had. The squadron I had 24 aircraft. I don't think one was ever supposed to put them in the air at any one time, because if you did, you'd never get them all down back on the carrier in time anyway. But technically, to be able to put those 24 aircraft in the air at any one time, one had to have 30 pilots and 30 aircraft. So we had an escort carrier literally to ourselves, just one squadron on an escort carrier.
One day, and the second scariest moment, taking off, you're supposed to jink to starboard to clear the flight deck of your slipstream for your buddy that's coming after you. Took off, tried to jink to starboard, couldn't move the joystick. Wouldn't move an inch either way. Up and down perfectly, so I climbed up to about 5,000 feet. Radio back that couldn't move the joystick. They said, well, try and do some aerobatic, which I thought that time was rather silly. I jiggled about, but eventually got it moving about 2 inches either way. Called up and said, well, I'm going to attempt. I didn't want to ditch or bail out or anything. I'll land on. So I did a huge, great circuit right the way round, and I'm probably the only Seafire pilot that ever did a 2-mile stern approach in a Seafire to land on. I did a silly thing, I suppose. I undid my harness because I had to lean out right over the side of the plane to see where I was going. I managed to land on, caught the third wire, and thank God for that batsman. I mean, we put our lives in the hands of batsmen on aircraft carriers. If they made a mistake, you had it. When I landed on, they found out what was wrong. A mechanic had left a spanner, which had jammed in the aileron yoke. He did get a telling off.
When we first heard about having to deck land Seafires, or Spitfires as it was then, on aircraft carriers, we thought, well, maybe on fleet carriers in daylight. And of course we finished up flying at night on escort carriers. Never dreamt we would, but we did. In those days they didn't have these glide paths, which I gather they have now, with the red, green and amber lights. You just had a batsman sitting on the end of the deck with lights on his bats. We didn't do very much of that, needless to say, but it was done and it was possible without too much hazard. But it wasn't easy, no.
After North Africa, our next operation was to support the fleet going through the Mediterranean en route to an ultimate goal of Alexandria in Egypt. So we operated against the Germans, no longer the French, and across to Malta, where we attacked Germans in southern Italy, and then further up into Italy.
We had the most fantastic time at Salerno in Seafires. I think there were 4 or 5 carriers there, 1 fleet carrier and some escort carriers. 125 Seafires started off with, and by the end of 3 days there were only 25 still flying, mainly through deck landing accidents, because there was no wind at Salerno. The escort carriers just weren't big enough to land the Seafire on when there was no wind. So of those 26, I think it was, landed, The Americans put a tractor through a tomato field, literally, so we could land on this tomato field, the 26 of us. And after 2 or 3 days flying, supporting the landings, of those 26, 25 flew back without any servicing at all, back to Malta. It's quite an incredible achievement. It says a lot for not only the Spitfire itself, but of course the Merlin engine, so reliable. Because pilots knew nothing about servicing an aircraft. We used to go around making sure, the tyres were reasonably well up and no loose wires hanging down. That was our servicing. So to get those back was quite an achievement. It said a lot for Rolls-Royce and the Spitfire.
And we reformed them, we got folding wings as well. The sailor had to unlock the wing underneath and put a pole in a hole and just lift it up and lock it there. They were like that. Very elementary, but perfectly satisfactory.
Up at crack of dawn at 6:30, through Valley, breakfast, part the watch to flying stations whenever they were flying, preparing the aircraft, and the daily inspections, doing the necessary work. You were on the maintenance unit. Lunch was as and when the availability of the ship's company used to go at meal times, but we had to go when the aircraft were away or as and when it was convenient. Your life surrounded by the aircraft, not the ship. You were there to do a job, whether it was day or night flying, you did it. And a bit peculiar sometimes when you're still in your hammock and then they come along and bang the side of it and say, come on, get up, and you don't even in bed now because you've been working all night. There you are. A few choice words were exchanged.
The idea of having a Navy fighter was to protect the fleet from enemy aircraft and to support the torpedo bombers while they were searching around for submarines. It was at a later stage that they then decided that the carriers would be very useful to go to support invasion landings. So the Seafire was used as really as an escort over the fleet against enemy aircraft, and a lot then on invasion, supporting the army.
One function of the Seafire was to help the ship's gunners to hit their targets on land some way from the ships. In these cases, the gunners were firing blind as they couldn't physically see their target.
The pilots are trained in spotting for naval bombardment and can either report the fall of shot for ship control or carry out the shoot by spotter control. The direction of the assault is carried out in the headquarters ship. This ship carries senior officers of the Navy, Army and Air Force who, with their staffs, coordinate and control all the complicated activities of such a combined operation. We'll assume that a landing has been made on Red Beach and the Army is getting reinforcements and supplies ashore in the face of enemy opposition. The Commander, Royal Artillery, reports to Bombardment Control that the beach is being heavily shelled by a gun battery which is apparently sighted somewhere to the northeast. He requests fire from naval guns to silence the battery. Bombardment Control, having anticipated such an emergency, has already detailed a fighter reconnaissance sortie from one of the assault carriers to orbit the beachhead and remain on call. Bombardment Control calls the aircraft and orders them to carry out an area search and to report any guns firing in the area. We'll go to the Bombardment Control in the headquarters ship.
Call up the aircraft we've got in reserve over the beach. Tell them to search this area and report any guns they see firing.
Very good. Cider 1, this is Airedale, over.
Airedale, this is Cider 1, over.
Search area 2 miles radius 240990 for guns firing and report back to Airedale, over.
Airedale, this is Cider 1. Search area 2 miles radius 240990 and report any guns firing to you, over.
Churchill.
Sir.
If they find the battery, I want Portsmouth to take it on. So get on to them, give them the briefing details, and tell them to listen out for any report from the aircraft.
Aye, aye, sir.
Bombardment Control, sir.
Right.
Captain?
Captain, sir. Bombardment Control have ordered an area search for a gun battery shelling Red Beach. We're to be ready to take it on as soon as it's located, sir.
What area is it, Guns?
We're just plotting it now, sir.
There you are. It's that area lying northeast of Red Beach.
Northeast of Red Beach, sir.
Northeast? In that case, I shall do this shoot underway. Let me know what develops.
Aye, aye, sir.
Airedale, this is Cider 1. Guns firing at 255-987. Over.
No, that can't be it. It's so close to our own troops. It must be a mortar battery, and I expect those tanks are after it. No good.
Right, tell the aircraft, no good. Continue reconnaissance further inland.
Cider 1, this is Airedale. Target at 255-987, no good. Continue reconnaissance further inland. Over.
Airedale, this is Cider 1. Wilco, out.
Airedale, this is Cider 1. Guns firing at 225-002. Over.
Yes, this looks much more like it. It's well inland and quite a mile from our own troops.
Right, we'll take it on. Tell the aircraft to take it on with turret.
Very good. Cider 1, this is Airedale. Engage target at 225-002 with bombarding ship, call sign, turret. Over.
Airedale, this is Cider 1. Engage target at 225-002 with bombarding ship, call sign, turret. Over.
This is Airedale. Engage target at 225-002. Over.
Airedale, this is turret. Engage target at 225-002. Over. 225-002, sir.
Map reference 225-002.
Captain?
The aircraft's located a gun battery in the area I gave you before, sir. Bombardment control have ordered us to engage it.
Very good, Guns. Carry on.
Aye, aye, sir.
Turret, this is Cider 1. Target, battery 225-002. Spotter control, over.
Cider 1, this is turret. Target, battery 225-002. Spotter control. Over.
This is Cider 1. Correct. Out.
Spotter control, sir.
Right. In that case, we must give him the bearing of line of fire. Faster TS, 8 turret broadsides. Spotter control.
Aye, aye, sir. A turret ready. Bearing 347. Range 132.
Faster spotter. Target bearing 347. Ready, 24.
This is turret. Target bearing 347. Ready, 24. Over.
This is Cider 1. Target bearing 347. Ready, 24. Over.
This is turret. Correct. Over.
This is Cider 1. Fire. Over.
Fire.
Shoot.
Shoot.
The spotter, having been given the bearing of the line of fire, keeps this in mind while waiting for the first salvo to fall.
Stand by. Flat. Over.
There's the first salvo. It's well over and to the left. In order to confirm the line of fire, the spotter orders a bold down correction calculated to cross the target for range.
Down 800, over.
Down 800. Over.
A 3-gun salvo was fired first to make sure the pilot could see it, but from now on, only single-gun salvos will be used for ranging. The spotter has now confirmed the line of fire and crossed the target for range. He must now get his shots in line with the center of the battery, so he orders a line correction.
Right 200, over.
Right 200, go on.
Flat. Over.
That round is correct for line, so the spotter now brackets for range.
Up 400, over.
Up 400. Over.
Correct, over.
Although the last round fell only about 200 yards short, the pilot ordered up 400 because it's only by bracketing that the range of the target can be found.
Ready. Over.
Fire, over.
There are 4 guns in the battery, fairly well spaced out. 1, 2, 3, 4. The spotter is ranging on the middle point of the battery. The spotter has now enclosed the target in a 400-yard bracket, so he halves the previous correction.
Down 200, fire for effect, slow fire, over.
Down 200, fire for effect, slow fire.
All turret salvos.
BPRTS, all turret salvos.
Down 200, fire for effect, slow fire, go on.
Down 200, fire for effect, slow fire, go on. This pilot seems to know his stuff. He's obviously got a 400-yard bracket, and that puts the target about there.
Yes.
Stand by. Left. Over.
Spreading fire, left 100, fire for effect, slow fire.
That sounds good. Faster TS, left 100, fire for effect, slow fire, go on.
Left. Over.
Right 200, fire for effect, slow fire, over.
Right 200, fire for effect, slow fire.
Left. Over.
Left 100, fire for effect, rapid fire, over.
Left 100, fire for effect, rapid fire.
Rapid.
Landreal, sir.
Sir?
How are we going?
Very well indeed, sir. This spotter's first class. We've had 3 salvos in the target area. We're now going to fire a rapid group to get their heads well and truly down.
Nice work. Let me know the result.
Aye, aye, sir.
Fire for effect, rapid fire. Ready? Over.
Fire, over.
Stand by. Left. Stand by. Left. Stand by. Left. Stand by. Left. Over.
Turret, this is Cider 1. All 4 salvos in target area. Cease fire, returning to base. Cheerio, out.
We had to join the ship in the Irish Sea from Leon. 3 or 4 times the sortie was cried up because of bad weather. 3rd time they said, right, we'll go. So you can imagine 24 pilots, never flown in formation or wing formation before, in flights of 4 across to Anglesey. We were just about over Birmingham when we ran into cloud, which ranged from about 800 feet at deck level up to 28,000 feet. When we ran into this cloud, I couldn't see either of them, so I thought, right, the only thing to do, full throttle, climb like the clappers, and get out of it. Eventually I came out at 28,000 feet. Poor old Johnny Brooks was the first casualty. He crashed into a Wellington in cloud and was killed. The rest of the wing, little aircraft popped up out of the clouds, and some went down, and the whole wing was scattered over the whole of Great Britain. Eventually, after 2 days, we reassembled in Mona on Anglesey. And next day, we were supposed to fly after the ship, which everybody did apart from me because they couldn't get my Seafire started. Couldn't get it started until about 4:30 in the afternoon. So I took off and was given directions towards the ship. First direction, didn't find it. Second direction, couldn't see it. Third direction headed me straight to the Welsh Hills. So I thought, no, it's getting dusk by that time. I better pack this up and go back to Mona, which I did. And there started my grand tour of North Africa.
Initially they had the hooks dropping from the fuselage, but then at the end they had sting hooks that come out the back end of the fuselage, so it was a separate unit dropped. And of course they had undercarriage problems, which the riggers used to do. So they used to come down and just bang. Whereas the Brits used to fly them on, the Yanks used to drop them on.
New carrier-based Seafires are upholding the Spitfire tradition in many theatres of war. Spitfires and Seafires have been developing along parallel lines, and here's one of the newest Seafires, Seafire 15, adapted for its special work with the Royal Navy. Straight away you'll notice many of the Spitfire recognition features you've heard about already. There's the pointed fin and rudder like Spitfire 8, and there's the long nose, designed to take the Griffon engine. Seafire 15 has 2 radiators like all the later Spitfires. But here's something new, a blister cockpit cover which has meant redesigning the top of the fuselage behind it. You can see what a difference it makes, especially when combined with the slight droop of the Griffon engine nose. This new cockpit cover won't be seen on all Seafire 15s, but nearly all future Seafires and Spitfires will have it. As time goes on, and as our operations spread and grow in intensity, other Spitfires and Seafires may appear on the battlefronts of the world. But the basic characteristics will still be there.
We had 45, we eventually fitted up with 90-gallon slipper tanks. They call them slipper tanks. They fitted under the belly. And I think we finished up with 90 gallons. This was the endurance for the Seafire, see how long it could stay in the air. I think I got 4.5 hours out of one with a slipper tank of 90 gallons on. I did a few experiments with various sizes, 45, and also wing pods as opposed to the slip-on tanks. The slip-on ones were more practical, I think. It was easier to feed into the main tanks and less wind resistance anyway, because it was almost part of the fuselage.
So it's different from other services because, as you know, the Navy is known as the family. You are family, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. There's another matlow, you don't even know him from another ship. But once you meet one another and you're having a drink or something in the bar, it is family, it's different from other services.
Well, I had a bit of a disagreement with the captain of this particular aircraft carrier, which better not go on record, I don't think. But let's cut a long story short, he managed to get rid of me. And I finished up as chief flying instructor at an air station in southern India called Cochin, where they were putting together various types of aircraft, crated out from this country, put together and then flown out to the Pacific at that time. Nothing ever happened, serious happened to me, but there was the odd story of undercarriages not coming down because it hadn't been put together properly, and people trying to do a left bank and the aircraft going to the right instead of the left and that sort of thing. But to a certain extent that was the pilot's fault anyway. He should have tested the controls before he took off. One or two hazardous things like that. Yes, the aircraft that were being put together were then, I think, flown off to an escort carrier that sort of was feeding the Pacific Fleet, basically. Late 44, I suppose, early 45.
And then we sailed up to Manus in New Guinea, which is our first stop, to join up with the American 7th Fleet. We had 4 carriers, 2 battleships, 6 cruisers, I think it's about 8 to 10 destroyers, formed the British Pacific Fleet. And we then became the part of the American fleets out in the Pacific. We had two American lieutenants who were the coordination between our fleet and the American fleet. And many a time they thank God that they run a line they called a limey carrier, because the British carriers had steel reinforced decks. The Americans had wooden decks, that's why they lost so many. The kamikaze pilots used to go straight through the American ships and blow up in the hangar. If they hit us, they just bounced off. And probably one of the most scary moments in my life out there was sitting strapped in the cockpit of a Seafire on the deck with the action station siren gone because the kamikaze pilots were coming over, and you had to sit on that until the whole fleet had turned into wind before you could take off and get out of the way. That was hairy, because you never knew when one was going to come down and hit the deck park.
I don't think I was ever frightened in the whole of my flying career. I was anxious from time to time, of course.
But the greatest fear, I think, was always fire, being badly injured by fire, as so many, particularly the RAF pilots were. That was our greatest fear. And seeing one's friends killed.
April the 1st, 1944, one hit our ship. It hit just at the base of the island, and the flash of the explosion actually did get through a crack where the barriers, stanchions were, into the hangar. It caused a bit of a fire there, but not too much. But unfortunately it killed 6 of our men who were in the fighter ready room at that time.
Cease firing! Cease firing!
But in 3/4 of an hour, that ship was made ready to land on again. I put the barriers back, cleared the mess away, and we landed on in 45 minutes. After that, kamikaze hit us. One or two of them had to land on American carriers. Stuart Gill had to land on the USS Wasp. Now, that used to carry Avengers and Corsairs, and those were very big aircraft. And the barriers on those manky carriers didn't have cross wires. They just had one top wire, one bottom wire, and they were good enough to stop any Corsair or Hellcat. But the poor old Seafire was quite a small plane. He virtually ran out of petrol. He had to land on that ship. Unfortunately, the top wire, no cross wires, went over the top of the cockpit and took his head off, which wasn't very clever.
Yeah, you know, you always had respect for them, but they were very, very friendly chaps, most of them.
Very close. You had to be. I mean, your life was in their hands as well, because if they didn't get the plane right, or if they left a spanner in the works, things could go wrong.
They had the wardroom, we had the messes. No, it was a very, very close association with most of them, because you know, you had to make sure that they stayed in the air, and they wanted you to make sure that you kept them there. It was that close, but it was good, you know. And I think most of the pilots were great lads anyway.
The whole fleet ran into a typhoon off Japan. We were 10 miles off the centre, and as I said, the whole British fleet was part of the American fleet. 3 of us in our cabin couldn't stay in the cabin. The luggage and everything else had been thrown about. So we went up on the Admiral's Bridge on the Indefatigable, and the most horrifying look to watch those 60, 70-foot waves pounding down, just rushing at you and pounding down on the ship. It was very scary. And we had, at the time, 6 Seafires arranged on deck and clamped down onto the deck. And not one was damaged. Not one. And all that.
You see, that's one of the main things with aircraft maintenance, that if you're slightly hesitant on what you're going to do, you always go and look and make sure what you're going to do is exactly what has to be done. You don't sort of, as you do in a car engine, if you're tuning it, put a stick behind you and get the right balance. You can't do that, it doesn't work that way. You've got to do it by what the book says, and that's basically why aircraft have been so successful with their maintenance over the years, because engineers don't just go off hat and do things, and it's all there in the book. If you've got a thing that you think to yourself, well, I don't know, I'll have to go and have a look at that, because you can't keep everything in your head, as you know yourself. Well, you had to sign the A700 form to say that you carried out all these checks that you have to do. And that was oversigned by the chief of the officer who was a chief architect. And when they were about and around the aircraft, they tell you what they wanted and you do what they wanted, and if you couldn't find what they were after, you tell them so, and then that was it.
George Baldwin had the pleasure of meeting King Farouk of Egypt.
Off Alexandria recently, His Majesty King Farouk spent 6 hours afloat in a British warship. warship was HMS Hunter, one of the Royal Navy's most modern and up-to-date assault aircraft carriers. King Farouk watched a demonstration of operational flying by the air arm, given by a wing of Seafire aircraft. After meeting the officers, the King was conducted on a tour of the ship. This was the first time His Majesty had sailed in a British vessel during the war, and throughout he was a most enthusiastic and interested spectator.
Came back to the United Kingdom, were re-equipped with a more advanced version of our Seafires, the Seafire 3, which was very much a naval aircraft with all the necessary modcoms for naval flying. And we set off and went to Sri Lanka. It was close to the end of the war. We were operating against Japanese ground forces in Burma. Where we were operating, they were in the jungle, and it was greatly a matter of guesswork. But the Seafire performed very well. We proceeded to do, I suppose, a full year of operations there. By that time, the main part of the fleet arm operating in the big carriers had wiped out Japanese opposition in the south, in southern Malaya and the islands to the south. Of course, finally, the war was over in that part of the world. We stayed there, I suppose, after the war for not much more than a month, and then we re-embarked in our carriers and came home to the UK.
The fleet air arm relied heavily on reconnaissance, so converted a number of Mark II and III Seafires by adding a pair of F-24 cameras. These aircraft were highly successful in this role.
The Pacific War ended August 45, and I wasn't demobbed and came back to this country around about April 46.
Somewhere off the Japanese coast, the British Pacific Carrier Force is watching to see that the Japanese do not infringe the surrender agreement. 3 of Britain's 30,000-ton carriers are there, with her most powerful battleship, HMS King George V. Seafire fighter aircraft and Avenger bombers are on the flight deck of one of the carriers. The Avenger's wings fold into position and she takes off, followed by the Seafires and the aircraft patrol over the fleet. The arrestor hook engages with sprung wires and the aircraft comes to rest. An Avenger lands safely and folds its wings as it taxis away. This one can be salvaged, however, and is towed away for repair. And so, though the war against Japan is over, the Navy's work in the Pacific goes on. Flying off narrow decks in rough or smooth seas is still just part of the day's work for the Fleet Air Arm pilots.
The first aircraft I was working on were the radial engine ones, but then as the Seafires and that came through, we became more and more than the Seafires. The early ones, right through the progression to the really up-to-date ones in 1948, which were really huge, powerful machines with twin props and Griffin engines. Had a lot more torque than what I remember. In fact, the last ones on the Seafire 47, I mean, she was a fantastic aircraft. Virtually climbed 90 degrees hanging on the props going up because they were counter-rotating props. Lieutenant Williams, when he flew that one that day from coming out from How Far to us, and he was 100 foot above the waves and he was doing best part of 500 miles an hour, which was incredible for a single-seater fighter. The advantage of counter-rotating props was to get the maximum of power in both aspects, because if you've got a single prop, the torque is all one way, but with the counter-rotating props, the power becomes a straight line as opposed to pulling you up. The problem with it brings its own problem in so much that it was difficult to check the oil leaks from the bottom end of the blades on the boss, so that the pilots were having trouble landing them on carriers because they had to look to see where bats was, and with the oil mist coming from them, which they shouldn't have done, but it did. No matter what we did, we couldn't seem to cure it very well. They were looking at themselves rather than seeing bats, because the blades going both ways had a mirror effect rather than just an oil mist. It was coming back and making a mirror of the lower half of the prop. So most of the pilots, when we were talking to them, used to say, you know, damn thing, all you can see is yourself when you're coming in. So it was a bit of a problem, I think, from their aspect. From our own aspect, there was no problem at all. Came out in '53 because I got caught in the trap with the Korean War, and then I came out after the Korean War was finished.
The last time Seafires saw frontline service was during the Korean War in 1951. The jet fighter was about to take over.
I commanded the first naval jet fighter squadron with supermarine attackers.
With the introduction of the attacker in 1951, the fate of the dependable Seafire was now a foregone conclusion.
As I came out, the squirts were all coming in. You know, the sea vampires and all that sort of stuff.
The Seafire was finally withdrawn in 1954.
The Seafire they were a lovely aeroplane to fly. They were, of course, never intended for deck landings. I think the powers that be that eventually decided to continue with them, despite the number of accidents they had, made the right decision. They were a very effective aeroplane.
I loved it. It was a beautiful plane to fly, as anybody that's flown a Spitfire knows. Most marvellous aircraft to fly. It had speed, it had manoeuvrability. I wouldn't have flown anything else.
Brilliant in parts, pretty horrible in others.
Flew all the marks of it from the Seafire 1 right up to the Seafire 45, which was an amazing aircraft. It was double the all-up weight of the Mark 1. It had 4 cannons as its armament, folding wings, very wide, strong undercarriage, a very much better view. So it was an aeroplane which had really been developed from a fairy-like prima donna of a fighter aircraft into a really rugged naval aircraft at the end.
Once the pilots got experience on them, and particularly on the fleet carriers, they became a very good Navy fighter. A lot of losses because of the weakness of the undercarriage and the bad visibility.
Of course, the engine, well, very modern Griffin engine, compared with the very light, not so powerful Merlins that had been in the earlier ones. Spitfire was an essential component of the Seafire 47, as it was called. Without that huge new Griffon engine, it would not have been any more suitable naval aircraft. It wasn't long in service, but I must say people who flew it did enjoy it, and I think it performed very well afloat.
Brilliant. Really brilliant. Had its drawbacks, I suppose, from the pilot side of it, I suppose. But yeah, otherwise, terrific plane.
It was a lovable aeroplane. I would sum it up like that nearly everybody I knew who flew it felt thoroughly at home in it, and felt that it always did what they wanted it to do. And it's safe, enjoyable, and efficient, in other words, in summary. My family name is Jimmy, and I was told at the end of my career, after all that I'd done for 30 years flying in the Navy, that I really was Lucky Jim, and I think that really sums it up very much indeed.